The radio crackled to life in the abandoned lighthouse, its static-filled voice cutting through the perpetual gray dawn that had become America's new normal. Cassian Thorne pressed his weathered ear closer to the receiver, his calloused fingers adjusting the frequency with practiced precision. 3 years had passed since the Crimson Plague turned 90% of the population into flesh-hungry abominations, and genuine human voices had become as rare as clean water. "This is Meridian Base calling all survivors," the transmission whispered through the static. "We have a cure. Repeat, we have developed a working cure. Coordinates to follow." Cassian's heart hammered against his ribs as he scribbled down the numbers, his pencil trembling in his grip. Around him, the lighthouse's circular room bore the scars of countless desperate nights, bullet holes in the walls, makeshift barricades, and the faint copper smell of old blood that never quite faded. He had been the lighthouse keeper before the world ended, guiding ships to safety. Now he guided something far more precious: hope. The heavy footsteps on the spiral staircase announced the arrival of Zephyra Blackwood, her military boots echoing against the metal steps. The former army medic had found Cassian's lighthouse 6 months ago, half dead from infected wounds and carrying secrets that still haunted her amber eyes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, revealing the jagged scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, a souvenir from the evacuation of Chicago. "Another false broadcast?" she asked, though something in Cassian's expression made her voice catch. "Listen," he said, rewinding the recording he had made. As Zephyra heard the message, her usual stoic mask cracked, revealing a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. She had been part of the original research team at the CDC before everything went to hell, and she knew the scientific impossibility of what they were hearing. The lighthouse beams swept across the desolate Maine coastline, illuminating the shambling forms of the infected as they prowled the rocky shores below. Some still wore the remnants of their former lives, a mailman's uniform here, a teacher's cardigan there, but their humanity had been stripped away, leaving only an insatiable hunger for living flesh. "It could be a trap," Zephyra said, though her voice lacked conviction. They had both seen too much cruelty from the living to trust easily. Bandits, cultists, and worse roamed the wasteland that America had become, preying on survivors with a viciousness that sometimes made the infected seem merciful by comparison. Cassian studied the coordinates again. Wyoming. The Meridian Research Facility. His finger traced an invisible path across the mental map he carried of their ruined nation. "It's a 2,000-mile journey through hell itself." "We can't make it alone," Zephyra said, moving to the window. Her trained eye automatically counted the infected below, 43 visible with likely dozens more hidden in the shadows. "We need a group, supplies, vehicles, and someone who knows the terrain." As if summoned by their conversation, a deep rumble echoed across the water. Both survivors tensed, weapons appearing in their hands with practiced speed. But instead of the groaning engines of raiders, they saw something miraculous. A small fishing boat cutting through the waves, flying a white flag and carrying 3 figures. Cassian grabbed his binoculars, focusing on the approaching vessel. "A woman and 2 men," he reported. "They look clean. Not infected." Clean humans were almost as rare as the radio transmission they had just received. The boat's engine coughed and died as it reached the rocky shore below the lighthouse. The 3 figures quickly secured their vessel and began the treacherous climb up the coastal path, moving with the efficient urgency of people who understood that lingering in the open meant death. Zephyra had already moved to the lighthouse's communication system, switching on the external speakers. "State your business and intentions." Her voice boomed across the rocks, professional and commanding. "We heard your beacon," came the reply from below. "We're looking for others who still believe in tomorrow." The voice belonged to a woman, strong despite the obvious exhaustion. "My name is Delphine Crossfire. These are my companions, Orion Steele and Ragnar Bloodworth. We have information about the Meridian transmission." Cassian and Zephyra exchanged glances. The timing was too convenient to be coincidence, yet something in the woman's voice carried an authenticity that their hardened instincts recognized. They had learned to read people quickly in this new world, those who could be trusted and those who would slit your throat for a can of beans. "Come up slowly," Cassian called down. "Keep your hands visible. Any sudden movements and we'll assume you're infected." As the 3 strangers climbed toward their sanctuary, Cassian felt the familiar weight of decision pressing down on him. The lighthouse had been safe, isolated, sustainable. But safety was a luxury they could no longer afford if the transmission was genuine. America lay dying beneath a plague that had already consumed most of the world, and somewhere in Wyoming, scientists claimed they had found salvation. The war for humanity's future was about to begin, and it would demand everything they had left to give. Delphine Crossfire stepped into the lighthouse's beacon room with the fluid grace of a predator, her ice-blue eyes immediately cataloging every detail, the weapon positions, escape routes, and the body language of her hosts. Her auburn hair was cropped short in a practical military style, and a tactical vest displayed an array of scars that spoke of countless close encounters with both the infected and the living threats that prowled the wasteland. Behind her came Orion Steele, a massive bear of a man whose gentle demeanor contrasted sharply with his intimidating physical presence. His thick beard was streaked with premature gray, and his hands, large enough to crush a skull, moved with surprising delicacy as he helped his injured companion navigate the final steps. Ragnar Bloodworth was clearly the worse for wear, favoring his left leg and breathing heavily. Despite his obvious pain, his silver eyes remained sharp and alert, constantly scanning for threats with the paranoid intensity of someone who had survived too many betrayals. A blood-soaked bandage wrapped around his thigh suggested a recent encounter with either infected or hostile humans. "We came from the south," Delphine began without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Boston fell completely 3 days ago. The safe zone is gone." The words hit Cassian and Zephyr like physical blows. Boston had been one of the last major strongholds, housing nearly 10,000 survivors behind military fortifications. Zephyr's medical training kicked in as she noticed Ragnar's condition. "You're bleeding through that bandage," she said, already moving toward her medical supplies. "Sit down before you collapse." "It's not a bite," Ragnar said quickly, understanding the unspoken question that haunted every injury in their world. "Bullet wound. Courtesy of the Crimson Skulls." The raider gang had been terrorizing the eastern seaboard for months, their red-painted vehicles and skull insignias becoming symbols of brutal anarchy. Orion finally spoke, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the lighthouse's metal structure. "They overran the Boston perimeter at dawn. Thousands of infected followed in their wake. We barely escaped with our lives." His massive hands clenched into fists as he spoke, the memories clearly fresh and painful. "The Meridian transmission," Cassian said, cutting to the heart of their situation. "You said you had information." Delphine nodded grimly. "Dr. Elena Voss is alive. She's the one broadcasting from Wyoming." The name meant nothing to Cassian, but Zephyr's sharp intake of breath suggested otherwise. "That's impossible," Zephyr whispered. "Elena died in Atlanta when the CDC fell. I saw the facility burning myself." "She escaped," Delphine continued. "Made it to the Meridian Research Facility before the military cordon collapsed. She's been working on the cure for 2 years, and according to our intelligence, she's succeeded." She paused, letting the magnitude of that statement settle over them. "But she needs something that only exists on the East Coast. A specific strain of the original virus, kept in a military biolab outside of New York." The infected below had grown agitated, their groaning becoming more frequent and urgent. Cassian moved to the window and cursed under his breath. "We've got company. Looks like your boat drew attention." A new group of infected was emerging from the inland forests, drawn by the noise and movement around the lighthouse. Ragnar struggled to his feet despite Zephyr's protests. "We can handle them." Orion brought some special party favors. His grin was sharp and predatory, the expression of a man who had learned to find joy in violence because the alternative was despair. Orion was already unpacking a military-grade duffel bag, revealing an arsenal that made Cassian whistle appreciatively. Military-spec assault rifles, grenades, and what appeared to be experimental sonic devices that could temporarily disorient the infected without attracting more from miles away. "Former weapons development specialist," Orion explained modestly. "I managed to grab some prototypes before my facility was overrun." His massive hands handled the deadly equipment with the same gentle care he had shown helping Ragnar up the stairs. The infected had reached the base of the lighthouse, their rotting fingers scrambling against the rock face as they sought a way up. Their moaning had become a chorus of hunger and rage that echoed off the coastal cliffs. More were arriving every minute, shambling out of the gray dawn mist like nightmares made flesh. "We need to move," Delphine said, checking her sidearm. "This position is about to become untenable." Her tactical mind was already calculating distances, ammunition counts, and escape routes. "The mainland will be crawling with infected within the hour." Zephyr finished bandaging Ragnar's wound with efficient professionalism. "You'll live, but you need real medical attention soon. That bullet is still in there and infection is a real risk." In their world, even minor injuries could become death sentences without proper treatment. Cashin made the decision that would change all their lives. We go to Wyoming. Together. He looked at each face in turn, seeing his own desperate hope reflected in their eyes. If Dr. Voss really has a cure, then we owe it to everyone who didn't make it this far to try. The lighthouse beam continued its mechanical sweep, illuminating an America that had become unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, their skyscrapers dark and broken. The countryside was overrun with infected hordes that moved like deadly tides across the landscape. Military installations sat abandoned, their sophisticated weapons useless against an enemy that felt no fear and knew no retreat. "We'll need supplies," Delphine said, already shifting into operational planning mode. "Transportation, fuel, food, ammunition. And we'll need to move fast. Every day we delay, more people die." Outside, the infected had found a crack in the lighthouse's foundation and were beginning to squeeze through. Their desperate hunger drove them to attempt climbs that should have been impossible, their broken bodies propelled by an insatiable need for living flesh. The war for America's future had found them, whether they were ready or not. 5 strangers bound together by circumstance and hope, carrying the weight of a dying nation's last chance for redemption. Part 3, The Road to Ruin. The armored truck rumbled through the skeletal remains of New Hampshire, its reinforced hull scarred from countless encounters with both infected and hostile humans. Cashin gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, navigating around the rusted husks of abandoned vehicles that littered Interstate 95 like metallic graveyards. 3 days had passed since they abandoned the lighthouse, and the reality of their journey was proving even more harrowing than their worst fears. In the passenger seat, Delphine studied a blood-stained road atlas, marking safe houses and danger zones with methodical precision. Her tactical experience had kept them alive through 2 major infected swarms and a running battle with scavengers near Portsmouth. The woman's ability to predict human behavior in crisis situations bordered on supernatural, as if the collapse of civilization had unlocked some primal understanding of survival dynamics. "Next checkpoint is Manchester," she announced, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that lined her face. "According to my intel, there's a National Guard depot with fuel reserves. But it's also prime territory for the Iron Wolves." The mercenary group had carved out a brutal kingdom in the ruins of New England, selling protection to settlements while simultaneously raiding them for supplies. Behind them, in the cargo area they had hastily converted into a mobile command center, Zephyra worked frantically over Ragnar's worsening condition. The bullet wound had become infected despite her best efforts, and fever was beginning to set in. Her medical supplies were running dangerously low, and proper surgical facilities seemed like an impossible luxury in their current situation. "His temperature is climbing," she reported grimly. "We need antibiotics and a sterile environment, or we're going to lose him." The unspoken reality hung heavy in the recycled air. In their world, losing a team member meant not just personal grief, but a potentially fatal reduction in their collective survival capabilities. Orion occupied the rear position, monitoring their surroundings through armored gun ports he had expertly modified during their brief stop in Maine. His experimental sonic devices had proven invaluable for clearing smaller groups of infected without attracting larger hordes, but ammunition for the conventional weapons remained a constant concern. "Movement at 2 o'clock, he rumbled, his gentle voice taking on a harder edge. "Looks like scouts. 3 motorcycles keeping pace with us from the ridge line." The Iron Wolves were known for their mobility, using modified bikes to harass larger vehicles until they broke down or ran out of fuel. Cashin pressed harder on the accelerator, coaxing more speed from their overloaded vehicle. The truck had been a construction transport before the plague, and while Orion's modifications had added armor and weapon systems, it was never designed for extended high-speed chases across broken terrain. The landscape around them told the story of America's fall in stark detail. Farmhouses stood empty and dark, their windows boarded or broken. Crops rotted in fields where no one remained to harvest them. Occasionally they passed the burned remains of military checkpoints, their sophisticated equipment scattered and useless against an enemy that felt no fear and followed no conventional tactics. Ragnar stirred on his makeshift stretcher, his silver eyes focusing with obvious effort. "The depot," he whispered hoarsely. "I know it. Used to run supply lines through there before everything went to hell." His expertise in logistics and supply chain management had made him valuable to various survivor groups, though it had also made him enemies among those who preferred to take resources by force rather than trade for them. "What's the layout?" Delphine asked, already shifting her tactical planning to incorporate new intelligence. "Underground fuel storage, medical supplies in the admin building, armory in the northeast corner. Ragnar managed before another fever spike left him shivering uncontrollably. But the access codes, they changed them weekly, and that was 3 years ago. The motorcycle scouts had been joined by others, and Orion counted at least 6 vehicles now paralleling their course. "They're boxing us in," he reported. "Classic Wolfpack tactics. They'll try to force us off the road where the terrain favors them." Through her binoculars, Delphine spotted the telltale signs of an ambush ahead: debris strategically placed to force vehicles into a killing zone, concealed positions overlooking the road, and the glint of weaponry in the afternoon sun. Roadblock ahead. They've been planning this for a while. Cashin's mind raced through their options. They could turn back, but the fuel gauge showed they were already running dangerously low. They could attempt to fight through, but against entrenched positions and superior numbers, their chances were grim. Or they could try something desperate and probably suicidal. "The depot," he said suddenly. "How far off the main road?" Ragnar struggled to focus through his fever. "Maybe 2 miles north. But the access road is narrow, defensible. If they follow us in there, we'll be trapped." "Better than being picked off on the highway," Delphine said, already understanding Cashin's thinking. "We make for the depot, secure what we can, and force them to come to us on our terms." The motorcycle engines were growing louder, their riders closing the distance with predatory confidence. Through the armored windows, they could see the Iron Wolves' distinctive tattoos and battle scars, marking them as veterans of countless raids and skirmishes. These weren't desperate scavengers. They were professional killers who had found their calling in the collapse of civilization. Orion armed one of his sonic devices, its experimental technology humming with barely contained energy. "If they get too close, I can discourage pursuit. But the battery life on these things is still unpredictable." The turnoff to the depot appeared ahead, marked by a rust-covered sign that had been peppered with bullet holes. Cashin yanked the wheel hard left, feeling the truck's rear end slide on the broken asphalt. Behind them, the motorcycles roared in pursuit, their riders whooping with predatory joy. "Contact in 30 seconds, Delphine announced, checking her rifle for the 100th time. "Remember, we need those supplies more than we need heroics. Get in, get what we need, and get out." But as they approached the National Guard depot, it became clear that their problems were just beginning. The facility's perimeter fence had been breached in multiple places, and scattered around the compound were the unmistakable signs of a massive infected presence. Hundreds of bodies lay scattered across the ground, but whether they belonged to humans or the infected was impossible to determine from their distance. "Jesus," Orion breathed. "Looks like the Iron Wolves aren't our only problem." The truck bounced over the broken ground as Cashin navigated toward what he hoped was still a functioning entrance. Behind them, the motorcycles had reached the access road, their engines screaming in the late afternoon air. And from within the depot compound itself, movement was beginning to stir as the noise of their approach awakened things that should have remained dormant. The war for survival was about to become a 3-way battle, with ammunition running low and no guarantee that any of them would live to see another dawn. The National Guard depot erupted into chaos as 3 separate forces converged in a deadly triangle of violence. Cashin drove the armored truck through the twisted remains of the perimeter fence, sparks flying as metal scraped against metal. The compound beyond was a nightmare landscape of scattered equipment, abandoned vehicles, and the shambling forms of infected military personnel who had been trapped here since the initial outbreak. The Iron Wolves' motorcycles poured through the breach behind them, their riders firing wildly as they navigated the debris-strewn courtyard. Their leader, a scarred woman with arms covered in violent tattoos, gestured frantically at her followers, trying to coordinate an attack while avoiding the growing number of infected that were emerging from the depot buildings. "Medical building, northeast corner," Ragnar gasped from his stretcher, his fever-bright eyes struggling to focus on the chaos outside. "Red Cross on the roof, you can't miss it." His condition had deteriorated rapidly during the chase, and Zephyr's increasingly desperate attempts to stabilize him were consuming their precious medical supplies. Orion unleashed one of his sonic devices toward the largest concentration of infected, the experimental weapon emitting a high-pitched whine that sent the creatures stumbling away in apparent confusion. "That should buy us a few minutes," he rumbled, "but the effect is temporary and I've only got 2 charges left." Delphine had already shifted into full tactical mode, her ice-blue eyes tracking multiple targets as she calculated their best approach to the medical facility. "The Iron Wolves are going to try to pin us down in the courtyard. We need to reach that building before they can establish crossfire positions." The truck's armored hull rang like a bell as rifle rounds impacted its sides, the Iron Wolves having quickly recovered from their initial surprise at encountering infected. Their tactics were brutally efficient, Half their force engaged the undead threats while the others focused on the valuable prize represented by the newcomer's vehicle and supplies. Cashin swerved around a burned-out Humvee, the lighthouse keeper's maritime experience translating surprisingly well to navigating hazardous terrain under fire. 30 seconds to the building, he shouted over the cacophony of gunfire, motorcycle engines and infected moaning. "Everyone ready?" The medical building loomed ahead, its military standard construction showing signs of hasty abandonment. Doors left open, windows broken from the inside, and scattered paperwork blowing across the compound like mechanical snow. But more importantly, it appeared to be clear of infected, suggesting that whatever evacuation procedures had been followed here might have actually worked. Zephyra was already preparing her emergency medical kit, knowing that they would have only minutes to find the antibiotics and surgical supplies Ragnar needed. Her experience treating combat wounds in the field had taught her to work quickly under pressure, but the primitive conditions they faced would test even her considerable skills. There, Orion pointed toward a loading dock at the building's rear. "We can back up to that platform, keep the truck between us and the worst of the fighting." His tactical understanding complemented Delphine's perfectly, the two of them forming an instinctive partnership forged in the crucible of survival. The Iron Wolves had realized their quarry's destination and were racing to intercept, their modified motorcycles weaving between infected and debris with reckless skill. Their leader screamed orders in a mixture of English and what sounded like military code, her voice cutting through the battle's chaos with practiced authority. "Contact front," Delphine called out, spotting muzzle flashes from inside the medical building. "We've got hostiles in our objective." It seemed the depot wasn't as abandoned as they had hoped, and someone else had already claimed the medical supplies as their territory. Cashin slammed the truck into reverse, backing toward the loading dock with desperate speed. The rear of the vehicle crashed into the platform with enough force to buckle metal, but the impact also created a crude bridge between their mobile fortress and their objective. "Move, move, move," Delphine barked, already out of the truck and laying down covering fire toward the building's windows. Her rifle spoke with practiced precision, each shot carefully aimed to suppress rather than necessarily kill. In their world, ammunition was too precious to waste on anything but guaranteed targets. Orion emerged from the truck carrying Ragnar in his massive arms, the injured man's weight seeming negligible despite his obvious illness. Zephyra followed close behind, her medical bag bouncing against her hip as she ran in a crouch toward the building's entrance. The infected had begun to converge on their position, drawn by the gunfire and the scent of fresh blood from Ragnar's wound. Their shambling gait belied a terrifying persistence, and more were emerging from the depot's various buildings with each passing moment. Some still wore the tattered remains of military uniforms, their service weapons long since lost or forgotten. "Breaching," Delphine announced, kicking in the medical building's rear door with explosive force. The interior beyond was dark and filled with overturned furniture, scattered medical equipment, and the acrid smell of old fear. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that could conceal any number of threats. Cashin provided rear security, his maritime experience with storms and emergencies translating into an almost supernatural calm under pressure. "Iron Wolves are regrouping," he reported. "They're going to try to storm the building in about 2 minutes." Inside the medical facility, Zephyra had located the pharmacy storage area and was frantically searching through scattered medication containers. "Antibiotics, antibiotics," she muttered, her trained hands sorting through the chaos with desperate efficiency. Many of the drugs had expired, but in their situation, expired medicine was infinitely better than no medicine at all. Orion had set Ragnar down on what appeared to be an examination table, the injured man's breathing becoming increasingly labored. "Stay with us," the big man urged, his gentle nature showing through despite the violence surrounding them. "We're going to get you fixed up." From outside came the distinctive whine of Orion's second sonic device, followed by the confused groaning of disoriented infected. But the weapon's effect was indeed temporary, and they could already hear the creatures beginning to reorganize themselves for another assault. "Got them," Zephyra announced triumphantly, holding up a handful of antibiotic vials. "It's not perfect, but it should knock down the infection if we can get him stabilized." She was already preparing an injection, her medical training taking over despite the increasingly desperate sounds of combat from outside. The Iron Wolves had reached the building, and the distinctive sound of motorcycle engines being deliberately revved announced their intention to use the bikes as mobile weapons platforms. Their leader's voice carried through the walls, offering negotiations that everyone knew were really ultimatums wrapped in false civility. "Come out now and we'll make it quick," she called. You've got something we want and we've got the numbers to take it. No point in making this harder than it needs to be. Delphine's response was a precisely aimed shot that sparked off the engine block of the nearest motorcycle. I think they have their answer, she said grimly, checking her ammunition count. Now we find out how badly they want what we're carrying. The siege of Manchester had begun, and none of them harbored any illusions about their chances of surviving it intact. Part 5, Blood and Bullets. The medical building shook under the impact of homemade explosives as the Iron Wolves launched their assault with professional brutality. Delphine had positioned herself at the front window, her rifle methodically picking off targets as they tried to advance across the compound's open ground. Each shot was calculated for maximum psychological impact, demonstrating that their quarry possessed both the skill and ammunition to make any direct assault extremely costly. Ragnar stabilizing, Zephyr reported from the makeshift surgical area she had established in the building's rear. The antibiotics were working, but the man's fever hadn't broken yet, and she was essentially performing battlefield surgery with equipment scavenged from scattered medical supplies. But he needs time to recover, and time is something we don't have. Orion had barricaded the rear entrance with overturned furniture and medical equipment, creating a defensive position that would at least slow down any flanking attempts. His remaining sonic device sat ready but unused. They were saving it for the most desperate moment, when the choice would be between revealing their last technological advantage or dying under the Iron Wolves' assault. The infected had been momentarily scattered by the explosions, but they were already beginning to regroup, drawn by the sounds of combat and the scent of fresh blood from both the wounded and the recently dead. Through the windows, Cashin could see dozens of shambling forms emerging from the depot's various buildings, their presence adding a chaotic third element to an already impossible situation. Leaders trying to flank around the east side, Cashin called out, his lighthouse keeper's experience with observation and navigation making him their natural spotter. She's got maybe 6 others with her, using the fuel trucks for cover. The abandoned military vehicles provided excellent concealment for anyone trying to avoid both gunfire and infected attention. Outside, the Iron Wolves leader was indeed coordinating a complex assault, her tactical experience evident in the way she used her forces to create multiple pressure points simultaneously. But she was also dealing with the same infected problem that plagued her quarry, and several of her riders had already fallen to the undead creatures that swarmed through the compound. We can't hold this position indefinitely, Delphine said, switching to a fresh magazine with practiced efficiency. They got us outnumbered and surrounded. We need an exit strategy. Her ice-blue eyes were already calculating angles and distances, looking for any advantage they could exploit. The tactical situation was complicated by Ragnar's condition. He could be moved, but not quickly and not without risk of reopening his wound. Zephyr had managed to extract the bullet and close the injury, but the man was still weak from blood loss and the fever that had nearly killed him. There, Orion pointed toward a series of underground tunnels visible through a grate in the building's floor. Storm drains. They probably connect to the main sewer system. His engineering background allowed him to read infrastructure in ways that could prove vital to their survival. Cashin studied the tunnel opening with growing interest. How far do you think they extend? Could we reach the perimeter without surfacing? The idea of crawling through underground passages while carrying an injured man wasn't appealing, but it was better than facing certain death in a sustained firefight. A new sound joined the chaos outside, the distinctive roar of diesel engines approaching at high speed. Through the smoke and confusion, they could see a convoy of heavily armored vehicles bearing down on the depot, their black paint schemes and professional formations marking them as something far more dangerous than simple raiders. Military? Zephyr asked, hope creeping into her voice. Worse, Delphine said grimly, recognizing the vehicle's modifications and tactical deployment. Black site contractors. Private military company. If they're here, it means someone with serious resources wants this depot secured. The mercenary company had earned a reputation for taking contracts that regular military units couldn't or wouldn't handle. The Iron Wolves were already repositioning to face this new threat, their leader screaming orders as her forces tried to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. But the contractors moved with mechanical precision, their combined arms approach designed to overwhelm resistance through superior firepower and coordination. Decision time, Cashin said, watching as the first contractor vehicles breached the depot perimeter. We go underground now or we try to negotiate with whoever wins this fight. Neither option offered much hope, but staying in the medical building was rapidly becoming suicidal. Orion was already prying up the floor grate, his massive strength making quick work of the corroded metal. The tunnels beyond were dark and narrow, filled with the smell of stagnant water and decades of urban decay. But they represented their only chance of escape from what was rapidly becoming a three-way battle for control of the depot. "I can carry Ragnar," Orion offered, though they all knew that navigating underground passages while carrying an injured man would slow them down considerably. "But we need to move now, before those contractors establish perimeter security." The sound of heavy weapons fire erupted outside as the Black Site mercenaries engaged both the Iron Wolves and the infected with ruthless efficiency. Their tactics were designed for maximum lethality, and the brief screams that punctuated the gunfire suggested they weren't particularly concerned with taking prisoners. Zephyra quickly packed her medical supplies, grabbing anything that might prove useful in their desperate flight. "He's as stable as I can make him," she reported. But any significant trauma could reopen the wound. Delphine took one last look around the medical facility, her tactical mind automatically cataloging what they were leaving behind. Ammunition, medical supplies, and potential weapons, all of which they desperately needed but couldn't carry in their current situation. "Into the tunnels," she ordered. "Single file, weapons ready. We have no idea what we might encounter down there." The underground passages of any major installation were likely to contain their own horrors, from infected who had sought shelter in the darkness to other survivors who had claimed the tunnels as their territory. Cashin went first, his lighthouse keeper's experience with confined spaces and emergency navigation making him the logical point man. Behind him came Orion carrying Ragnar, the big man's bulk nearly filling the tunnel as he carefully maneuvered his unconscious burden through the darkness. Above them, the battle for the depot continued with increasing intensity. The contractors were systematically eliminating both the Iron Wolves and the infected, their professional ruthlessness evident in the methodical way they cleared each building. But their presence raised disturbing questions about who might be tracking the survivors and why. The tunnel stretched ahead into absolute darkness, filled with unknown dangers and offering no guarantee of escape. But behind them lay certain death, and sometimes the choice between bad options and worse ones was the only choice survivors had left. Their war for America's future had driven them underground, into the literal foundations of the civilization they were trying to save. Part 6. The Underground Railroad. The storm drains beneath the Manchester depot formed a labyrinthine network that had been designed to handle New England's harsh weather, but 3 years of neglect had transformed them into something far more sinister. Cashin led their desperate procession through knee-deep water that reeked of industrial chemicals and organic decay, his lighthouse keeper's instincts guiding them through passages that branched and twisted in seemingly random directions. Behind him, Orion struggled with Ragnar's unconscious form, the big man's gentleness at odds with the increasingly treacherous conditions they faced. The injured survivor had regained consciousness briefly, long enough to mumble fragmentary warnings about the tunnels not being empty, before fever pulled him back into delirium. Zephyra followed close behind, her medical bag sealed in a waterproof container as she tried to monitor Ragnar's condition by feel in the absolute darkness. The antibiotics had stopped the infection spread, but his body was still fighting the trauma of surgery performed under battlefield conditions, and their current environment was hardly conducive to recovery. Delphine brought up the rear, her military training allowing her to navigate backwards through the tunnels while maintaining watch for pursuit. The sounds of battle above had gradually faded, replaced by the methodical footsteps and radio chatter of the Black Site contractors as they secured the depot. Professional soldiers, unlike raiders or desperate survivors, would eventually think to check the tunnel systems. "Branch ahead," Cashin whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of dripping water and distant mechanical noise. 3 passages. Middle one slopes upward. His navigation was based purely on intuition and experience, but they had no choice except to trust his judgment. The middle tunnel did indeed rise, leading them away from the worst of the contaminated water toward what Cashin hoped would be a storm outlet beyond the depot's perimeter. But as they climbed, new sounds began to echo through the darkness, not the organized movement of military units, but something far more disturbing. Scratching. Scrabbling. The wet, sliding sound of bodies moving through confined spaces. "We're not alone down here," Orion rumbled, his voice tight with concern. Even his massive frame felt vulnerable in the narrow passages, where his size advantage meant nothing and maneuverability was severely limited.